Hi, everyone. Can I just say I'm still pretty salty about this whole meta thing? It's like a perfectly good nerd word. It's been commercialized and commodified. But then again, I do come from this world in which everything is all about openness and freedom, so I'm just going to have to pull that in. Anyway, until earlier this year, I was the CEO of the organization behind Wikipedia, as you just heard. And for the majority of my time there, over the last 7 years, we found ourselves in the middle of this sort of global crisis of truth, meaning that one of the questions that I often heard during this period was, what is it like to be responsible for the truth? And every time I got that question, I thought, wow, you're putting way too much on Wikipedia and on me, but also, I think you don't necessarily have an understanding of what Wikipedia is, because Wikipedia isn't exactly the truth, and that's important. It doesn't mean that it's not accurate or valuable or even indispensable, but the truth, the idea of a firm and final resolution to reality, isn't really congruent with the way that Wikipedia works, or the way that we as humans come to understandings about the world, or use that information to make decisions. In other words, the idea of the truth is it's complicated, it's evolutionary, it's unstable. A story then, perhaps, to illustrate what I mean. So about 500 years ago, this incendiary pamphlet, the Commentarius, started making the rounds of medieval Europe. It scandalized and it thrilled those who were able to get their hands on it. Popes and bishops directed their subordinates to do whatever it is that they could to be able to bring home a copy. The now famous reformist theologian you may have heard of, Martin Luther, was so worked up about the ideas in this pamphlet that he went out on the offensive, calling the author a fool and an upstart. 25 years later, the pamphlet's author decided to put those dangerous ideas together in a book. By the publishing standards of the time, his book was not a success. Maybe it was Martin Luther's PR offensive, that holy war, or maybe it was the author's dense and overly technical writing. But, and I'm always stumble over the pronunciation of the Latin, the Revolutionibus Orbium Coelestium went to an initial print run of about 400 copies, and it completely failed to sell out. Its author, Nicholas Copernicus, whom you may have heard of, may have been a revolutionary astronomer, but he died without his ideas ever achieving mainstream acceptance. Of course, today we're all familiar with Copernicus. So what does his story tell us about how we think, or how humans think, of the truth? At the time of the publication of Copernicus's book, known in English as The Revolution of Heavenly Bodies, it was an accepted scientific fact, of course, that the sun revolved around the Earth. This idea, known as geocentrism, had been put forward by no one less than Aristotle. But it was the Greek philosopher, astronomer, mathematician, and these guys all did 1,000 things back in those days, Ptolemy, who developed a model that would then come to dominate our later understanding of how the universe worked. Despite vocal and early skeptics, that idea, supported by superstition, religious fervor, and frankly, a lack of telescopes, went on to dominate for about another 500 years. After Copernicus's book, it would take another 200 years for the public understanding of the science of the universe to really change. It would require Galileo Galilei to invent telescopes so that we could actually see the revolution of those heavenly bodies. It would require him to go to trial, in which he himself was described as foolish, absurd, heretical, and contradictory. Why was this? We had the science, we had the information. People resisted the evidence not because it wasn't the truth, but because it challenged their models of how the world behaved, and in doing so, challenged what they believed about who they were. This medieval intellectual wrestling match reminds us of something, which is that truth, by definition, is malleable. It changes and is changing. It has as much to do with what we know, what we can know, and what we don't know, as what we believe and what we uphold in order to make sense of our own lives. And if we're to understand truth, and if we're to use it wisely, then we need to understand this mutability as one of its most fundamental properties. And perhaps we should also remember, in the spirit of Galileo and of Copernicus, that the search for truth is not easy or swift or without consequence. And yet, for some reason, the harder truth is to discern, it seems, the more intent these days we are upon finding it. So much of our public dialogue is about the truth: who has it, who betrays it, and whether to believe it. As I mentioned, we find ourselves in the middle of a global epistemic crisis. We are awash in mistruths, in half-truths, in campaigns of disinformation, in questions about whether the truth exists at all. With our Portuguese hosts here, perhaps as a notable exception, and big props up to Portugal, we've seen global distrust and resistance to health guidance against the backdrop of this deadly pandemic that we've all been living through. Across Western nations, we've seen confidence in the integrity and value of democracy collapse, and an accompanying strengthening of autocratic, xenophobic, and nationalist ideologies. And in my own country, the United States, confidence in journalism, that essential pillar of a democracy and accountable society, has been on a 20-year decline. People are disillusioned by seemingly intractable problems and the challenges that we face as a world, from climate change to runaway income inequality. We see these challenges as failures of the institutions that we have long trusted to keep us safe and to keep our civic trust. We are skeptical that these institutions are going to be able to respond to the changing needs and collective challenges of a growing, globalized, and increasingly heterogeneous world. We don't know who to believe, we don't know who to trust, and frankly, we're all exhausted. So what if there was a better way? Not necessarily an easier one, I do want to say that, but what if we could find a way to knit together our differences as a way of finding commonality? If we could see our incomplete understanding as an opportunity to learn from one another, if we could recognize that a plurality of perspectives might give us a finer and more complete rendering than one alone. So this is the point, of course, where I start talking about what I think we can learn from Wikipedia. You probably all saw that coming. But before I do, I want to be really clear. For all my love for Wikipedia, I'm not here to sell you on its perfection. I do view it as pretty flawed. It is mostly accurate, yes, but it can also be inaccurate and incomplete at times. More importantly, though, it's as biased as we all are. As a source built on other sources, it reflects the world that we have built, and its emissions reflect the worlds that we could have lived. Its policies of sourcing offer preference to European models of reference to the written word, excluding, for example, oral traditions. It is famously written by men, about 80% of its contributors, which means that there's so much missing from the other half of the human experience, not just the other half. The inclusivity, the entirety of the human experience. It's not just that women and other non-binary and non-gender conforming individuals are missing from who writes Wikipedia. It also means that they're missing from the history and the experience of how society has been shaped and formed. And of course, it has been written by the victors. All of the peoples and countries and cultures that have historically not dominated our understanding of world history are also missing in many ways from the written word. But it's not Wikipedia's fallibility that I'm here to talk about, of course. It's actually its promise. I want to talk about what it represents, the promise that it offers. For me, for years, the reason I got out of bed every morning was the fact that I believe it's a marvel. It's an act of pure human generosity, giving free knowledge to the world, and also a representation of some of our most base instincts of ego and the desire to get it right on the internet. And yet it somehow manages to be mostly right while not pretending to be truth. Instead, it's a work in progress that grows stronger through questioning, revision, that becomes more accurate and complete with greater representation, that holds ambiguity comfortably without shying from conclusions. And because it's written by volunteers who are, of course, ordinary people, just like yourselves and myself, it's not out of magical technology wizardry. It's just us. It's what we do every day. So what can we learn from us? I believe the secret is in the process themselves. It is the fact that Wikipedia brings people together who may have everything or nothing in common. It pushes us to work together across our divides. It asks us to reckon with differences of politics, of history, and perspective in order to find resolution. And perhaps most importantly, it requires that we do so in a way that most people in the world can agree with and recognize the outcomes as being fair and reasonable. Of course, this is easier in some spaces than in others. A list of animals that have been to space, it's pretty simple. But what about the harder topics, where our greatest collective challenges lie? In other aspects of our lives, these just are often our most contentious conversations. Our disagreements tend to erupt over what the truth of the issue actually is. Conversations about politics and religion are difficult conversations on Wikipedia too. But one of the most significant differences, critical for moving from polarization to productivity, is that the Wikipedians who write these articles aren't actually focused on finding the truth. They're working for something that's a little bit more attainable, which is the best of what we can know right now. And after 7 years there, I actually believe that they're onto something. That for our most tricky disagreements, seeking the truth and seeking to convince others of the truth isn't necessarily the best place to start. In fact, I think our reverence for the truth might have become a bit of a distraction that is preventing us from finding consensus and getting important things done. Now, none of that's to say that the truth isn't important. The truth obviously exists. It's at the core, or the search for the truth is at the core of some of our greatest human achievements. It can animate and inspire us to do, learn, and create great things. But I think in our messy human hearts, we also know that the truth is something of a fickle mistress, and that the beauty of the truth is actually often in the struggle. It's the reason that we have so many sublime chronicles of the human experience, because there are so many different truths to be explored. And so in this spirit, I know that the truth exists for each of you in this room. It also probably exists for the person sitting next to you. But the thing is, the two of you don't necessarily have the same truths. And this is because for many of us, truth is what we make when we merge facts about the world with our beliefs about the world. Each of us has our own truth, and it's probably a good one. It's based on things like where we come from, how we were raised, how other people see us. And I'm sure your neighbor is lovely and reasonable. You can go ahead and take a look. Seem like a nice person, right? So probably you two can get together and work it out. But what happens when a third person joins the conversation, or a fourth and a fifth? And now what happens when the conversation is at the scale of all 7.8 billion of us? The thing is, we are a vast and varied world, and our truths are real to us and often the source of great power. But when we try to use our own personal truths as the basis for working together collectively, we start to run into trouble, because our truth is not the same as other people's truths. And if we start going back and forth about whose truth is the best, suddenly we find ourselves further apart than when we started, caught up in questions of values and identity. We start focusing on what we disagree on rather than what connects us. We start using the word truth to reflect, instead of using the word truth to reflect what can be known, we start using it to stand for what we believe in ways that can be deeply divisive and harmful. And this division, of course, has real-world consequences. So this weekend, we know that thousands of people from around the globe are gathering in Scotland at the UN's climate conference, COP26. Yeah, 26. That's right, 26 years of them. The goal of this conference is to reach net zero carbon emissions by the middle of the century, which I think was the goal of the conference 26 years ago, too, in order to keep 1.5 degree warming within reach. But most climate scientists, they think maybe that ship has sailed. And of course, it's not that we haven't known the facts. For decades, we've had powerful data about the negative impact of man-made carbon in the atmosphere. But the reckoning of the truth of that data, the implications for what it meant for the world, was not unlike the initial reaction to our friend Copernicus. We were challenged by what it said about who we are and what we value. And the resulting public disagreement about the truth of the matter stopped us from addressing the facts of the matter and delayed us from instigating urgent and specific mitigation actions that would have helped protect our communities from rising seas, increasingly powerful storms, and deadly waves of heat and cold. On climate, of course, we've moved a little faster than most medieval scholars, maybe by about 100 years. But 50% faster isn't good enough, not for the challenges that we face. We need better ways of converging on shared understanding. And so I'd propose perhaps recognizing the need for a different kind of truth. If the Copernican revolution represents the truth tested, that is to say, science, and the humanities represent the truth sought, their art and religion, perhaps we need a truth for a cooperative existence, consensus and action. I think of this as a minimum viable truth, one that starts with what we can know and what we can agree on right now. The good news is there's a lot that we can know and agree on, right? So we've got facts like the date of an event and who was in the room. We've got data that we can use, the measurement of physical phenomenon. And these are wonderful tools. They let us send rovers to Mars. They let us track endangered species. They let us predict the weather, so you all know to wear hopefully warm and dry clothes. But they're not truths, right? They're just the best informed, most recent agreement about what we can know about the world right now, based on trial and error and exploration. They're useful, but they're not enough. Necessary, but not sufficient. They may not be enough to change people's minds and unite different views. So can we turn this productive abundance of information instead into something approaching agreement and action? I'd argue that we need to shift from focusing on one unifying truth to just finding enough agreement to move forward. Rather than resolving everything, we focus on the incremental. At Wikipedia, we strove to get it right enough to enough people to be useful enough of the time. We accepted that what we knew will change, and we understood that impermanence and incompletion are fundamental attributes of the world. We set aside our bigger beliefs and don't ask for perfect resolution. And one of the reasons this can work, one of the reasons that I believe it doesn't just work on Wikipedia, because again, that's just us, one of the reasons that I believe this can work in the broader context of the work that each and every one of us does, is that minimum viable truth, this idea of a common understanding that we can all get behind, is a fundamentally forgiving idea, perhaps even an act of love. It recognizes that we humans are messy and that our capacity for integration of new and different ideas is uneven and perhaps fundamentally limited. It acknowledges our inherent biases and our different perspectives. It allows for mistakes and uncertainty, friction and disagreement in the pursuit of answers. Instead of asking us to do more than we are capable of, it asks us to find strength in being ourselves. And therein lies the beauty. By loosening up a little bit, by leaning into our messy humanity, we can start turning our weaknesses into strengths. In 2019, some researchers released a study about how Wikipedia works, and particularly on contentious and difficult topics like science and politics and social issues. And what they found was that the best and often the most accurate articles were actually those that were written by people who generally disagree with each other. They found something else that was truly remarkable, which is that the more that these polarized contributors work together, folks from wildly different understandings of the world or political topics, the more balanced and constructive their contributions became over time, which, in my mind, makes it one of the only places on the internet that you go to disagree and in the process become more agreeable. I think that the more that we struggle together, the more that we can understand each other. And so what are the lessons that we can learn from this website, of course, but really just this practice of people? The first is to stay focused. If grand theories of the truth often falter, it's because they've spread their wings too wide. To find common agreement, we need to stay small. At Wikipedia, people aren't expected to agree on everything from the merits of horror movies to macroeconomics. They just are expected to find agreement on the one thing that they're discussing in that moment. Our search for common ground doesn't require that we see everything the same way. Just meet in the middle frequently enough to find connection. Practice neutrality. So Wikipedia assumes that we're all inherently biased. It's one of the reasons you're not allowed to write articles about yourself, because it would be probably pretty difficult to be neutral about how brilliant and remarkable you actually are. So when we're forced to defend ourselves, not just when we talk about our accomplishments, but when we talk about our views of the world, defend those biases that we have against the perspectives of others, present them in a neutral way, find sources, find the basis for our arguments, an intellectual grappling ensues that can really push us to broaden our views and come to new forms of agreement. We should set collective norms of engagement. Dialogue and opposition to one another can require a tremendous amount of work, emotional labor, and the validity of seeing and understanding different views. Challenging conversation through clear practices can help keep our friction productive instead of personal, so we can focus on the substance of the agreement rather than the identity of our debater. Engaging everyone in a conversation and upholding these principles so that we have a shared responsibility for success is critical to the outcome of the collective. We should embrace interdependence. A truth about truths is that they're always incomplete. To find better truths, we must bring more and more diverse voices into the room so that we can see more holistically through more lived experiences. It's the old parable of the blind men and the elephant. Our individual experience might be subjectively true, but our collective range of experiences is undoubtedly better informed. We should accept that all things end. Knowledge has its own entropy, and our confidence in what we know should be humbled by what we do not. In Wikipedia, there's this wonderful story. In the 19th century, the first edition of Encyclopedia Britannica or something along those lines, first, second, seventh, I can't recall, finally entered into the public domain. And people were so excited by the fact that this knowledge was available for them to reuse in any way they saw fit. But it turned out that of all of that scholarship, it had been eclipsed by time, by better scholarship, by more modern readings. Everything that we know has a half-life, and we must remain open to all that we do not know. And then last, move with the speed of intention. It's not the same thing as moving slowly per se, but instead of moving quickly and breaking things, moving with deliberation and focus means consulting widely, listening with sincerity, debating with respect, and weighing trade-offs with candor. We must ensure we must ensure first that we explore all the ways that we could fail before we know all the ways in which we could succeed. And in the process of doing so, we actually go through the process of building more enduring agreement and trust, which is, if anything, the thing that we need to be able to move forward with uncertainty and into challenge. Each one of you here is a keeper of a beautiful truth. You represent your own truth and the truths that we might know together. I want to honor these, whatever they might be, wherever they are. They have a place in this world in pursuit of art and community and understanding. They have a place in the friction and frisson of new discoveries and great inspiration. They may also be part of what prevents us from connecting with one another outside of these walls and finding the fortitude to do great things on behalf of what we share with others. So I'm asking, as an exercise, that each of you in the coming days finds a moment to set aside your personal truth for a moment and sit in someone else's, to endure the productive friction of considering how to work with others, including people you might not agree with or even like, in order to find common ground and common purpose. I'm asking you to see more fully together how we might make one another whole, perhaps to engage in an act of love. Thank you.